Hi, welcome to Weekend Review, where we look at some of the news and the headlines. I'm Phil O'Connor, the Live Enterprise Director, joined this week by another stellar cast. We have Justin Wingirter. From sports, we have Ryan Sharp, and my old friend from business, Don Mecoy. A lot going on again this weekend, gentlemen. Let's get started with news out of the political realm. Our former state attorney general finds himself in a little bit of hot water over his travel. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, we know Scott Pruitt spent about $14,000 on one day of travel in July. He flew from Tulsa to Guyman to here in Oklahoma City on a government plane, a Department of Interior plane. $14,434 for one day of flights. Something he could have drove, something he could have flown commercial, at least between Tulsa and Oklahoma City.
I understand that you might be partly responsible for this, though, Justin, because what was the reason he was in Oklahoma City?
He was here to be interviewed by me. He was also meeting with our editorial board here at the Oklahoman. So he also says he met with state lawmakers while he was here, so I shouldn't be entirely to blame.
And this is a pattern that's obviously, especially this week, has popped up as a huge issue for the White House. We've got at least 4 administration officials accused of using, or not accused, but have been using government planes, military planes for travel, and it's created a lot of consternation among a lot of folks. Talk a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, this is probably bigger news than it otherwise would have been if it stood alone. But there seems to be a pattern here. The EPA is very quick to say this is not what Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price has been doing. This is not to that extent. It's not as egregious. And these are mostly not charter planes. He did take one charter plane in Colorado, but otherwise Pruitt's been using government planes. So they say that's different than Price's situation, where Price spent more than $1 million on travel, mostly in private, sort of ritzy private charter planes.
And then you've got Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, you've got Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, both also being questioned about their use of these kinds of planes.
Right.
They often come back to this thing of they need them for the secure communications on board, and I just wonder why previous secretaries. I heard this morning that they talked to Kathleen Sebelius, never took a private plane during her 5-year tenure as the secretary.
For Pruitt, is primarily, according to the EPA, primarily to get around quicker. I mean, driving takes a while. Commercial planes sometimes get delayed. A private plane or a government plane does not get delayed. It can take off when it needs to. It can land when it needs to. So that is primarily the EPA's reasoning behind Scott Pruitt's travel on a government plane.
And talking about secure communications, another issue that the former Attorney General is dealing with a little bit is this new soundproof booth, essentially, he had installed in his office.
Again, much like the travel, this is not a standalone issue. If it was a standalone issue, maybe it's not as big of an issue, but it's part of a trend of unusual spending by Scott Pruitt here. And he's made a number of, while cutting the EPA budget, has made some unusual purchases for his own office and for the EPA brass, and that's raised some questions about spending at the EPA.
And Pruitt came under criticism here as the Attorney General for increasing the size of his offices, opening a new office in Tulsa, some of the spending that was done to refurbish some of those offices. So a lot of questions surrounding him. We'll see how that plays out. Another Oklahoma politician in the news this week, Senator Langford, bringing up the fact that Russia may actually have been poking its nose into the NFL debate.
Yeah, this is a rather unusual headline that garnered some attention this week. Senator Langford is a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's privy to some of intelligence from CIA, NSA, etc. And he seemed to want to get some off his chest this week. An unusual piece of intelligence he picked up that Russian bots, these automated Twitter accounts primarily, have been spreading NFL hashtags on both sides, actually, either supporting players who kneel or supporting players or other people who oppose the kneeling, in order to create this division within American society, or maybe worse than the division that is already there. So we primarily see this with Russian bots when it comes to elections, and obviously that's a far more serious concern in creating those divisions around times of election, but apparently they also did it during this last weekend of NFL debates.
Sadly, I'm wondering though, for more people, they're probably more upset about the Russians meddling with the NFL than they probably are in the American elections.
Wow.
Don't mess with the NFL.
Yeah.
Okay, and then finally, let's talk about the special session. It's been a special session.
Yeah, in some ways there's not much to talk about. We're at a stalemate, frankly. Democrats continue to meet with Republicans and the governor's office to try to come up with some agreement. Otherwise, committee hearings have been canceled. There are no floor and Senate votes for several days now, and we have no agreement. So they will continue to work out an agreement behind closed doors. We'll get 24-hour notice before they vote on the bill. They need 3/4 vote in the House and Senate, which is a difficult measure to come by if they want to raise revenue. If not, it's budget cuts for several agencies or perhaps the entire state budget, depending on how they want to split that up.
But Justin, didn't they meet beforehand to determine what and how they would do things in the special session? And if they did, why are we in this position? And if they didn't, why did we have this special session?
They did meet. There were several weeks between, 2 weeks rather, between the governor's call for a special session and when that special session actually began. Ideally, you would have figured out an agreement in those 2 weeks, come in, voted, and very quickly got this over with. It certainly looks bad that they're in a stalemate right now and going nowhere.
Not to put you on the spot, how much does it cost a day to run a special session?
It costs $30,000 a day to run a special session. That is when the full House and Senate are in. They're not in right now. Speaker McCall on Wednesday more or less ended the week to save some money, or at least not spend any more. So since they don't have an agreement, House leaders, Senate leaders, and the governor are meeting behind closed doors. Because they're not in session, they don't necessarily spend all of that money. Some committee members are meeting and they will spend money, but otherwise the House and Senate are not spending the full $30,000 a day.
And then bottom line, failure to reach an agreement on raising revenue essentially means we are once again looking at dramatic cuts to the state budget.
Yeah, there's a $250 million hole. You either raise revenue to fill that hole or you cut your way out of it. Right now it would be cuts to 3 or 4 health agencies that would be pretty drastic. They can either go with those cuts or they can spread those cuts out across the entire state government. So it's more like a 2 or 3% cut to every department in state government, corrections, agriculture, I mean, across the board. So if they want to go with the cuts, they have some options there. The governor has told them, do not cut state government any further. State government has been cut far enough, and you need to find revenue. So she will not go along with any plan that cuts government, but to raise revenue, you need 3/4. So they're on a difficult plane either way there.
Yeah, Department of Health talking about furloughs, closing programs down. They say they're looking at $60 million loss here, and that they don't have that money to lose anymore. That they've essentially been cut to the bone.
I was talking to them the other day, and it's exactly right. They say they've trimmed the fat away. They've cut $66 million the last 3 years in administrative costs, and it's programs and services that will be cut from here on out. They can't trim the fat anymore. They will cut programs and services.
Oh,
so, yeah.
We'll continue to keep an eye on that. Thanks, Justin. Thanks for the update. Ryan, bad news for Oklahoma State this weekend. Don't want to think that we just trolling bad news here, but man, that's a black eye to the program for sure.
It is. We found out on Tuesday that after a 2-year investigation by the FBI, not the NCAA, the FBI, that Oklahoma State associate head coach Lamont Evans was going to face federal charges for bribery and corruption. Evans is one of 4 assistant coaches in basketball that are going to face charges, along with about 6 other individuals, ranging from financial advisors to an apparel, a fairly big wig in an apparel company. They're all going to face federal charges for essentially taking money to try to steer potential or current student athletes towards financial advisors, towards certain apparel companies, or even towards certain schools. And we were talking a little bit earlier about, this assistant coach holds sort of a special place in the basketball community, one of the highest paid assistant coaches in the country. He is. He was set to make $600,000 this year. He started out at $500 and had escalators that kind of bumped his salary up each year. He is a holdover from the previous coach, Brad Underwood, who coached last season and then left for Illinois, brought Lamont Evans in from South Carolina. Evans was on South Carolina staff with Frank Martin, who was at Kansas State. So people around here are familiar with the kind of coaching tree that these guys have followed. But $600,000 for an assistant basketball coach is quite a bit. So he was already making a lot of money, which again raises questions. His part of the federal charges that were filed said he took at least $22,000. Who knows how much it actually was? But in those charges, it lists $22,000 worth of bribes and kickbacks for pointing student athletes into certain directions. And
I think it was Jenny had a story this week about the nature of some of those contacts were happening on game days, even in some cases.
One of them in particular was in January of this past year, or January of this year, I'm sorry, the night before a game at West Virginia. He met with a financial advisor and a student athlete in his hotel room the night before Oklahoma State played West Virginia. So it was pretty brazen, obviously not something new that he'd done before. So.
I know it's a little early to say or whatever, but is there any thought that this will have a negative impact on the basketball program? Are they a possibility of facing sanctions?
You've got to think when the FBI comes in and does an investigation, it's not something that has a whole lot of holes in it to be poked in it. Unlike an NCAA investigation, where they don't have quite the standard to meet that the FBI does for federal charges. And so now you've got all these charges lined out in federal court documents that the NCAA, all they have to do is come through and confirm. You would assume anyway, all they have to do is come through and confirm. And then you're talking about eligibility issues of current athletes, vacation of wins from former athletes. And this goes across several different schools, obviously. But for Oklahoma State, there's a couple of athletes that are possibly in question, one of which is still at the school. We aren't 100% certain who that is just yet.
Well, but we did. There were some indications and clues about who it might be. And
yeah, we've narrowed it down just because of how the timeline and things like that. You're looking at guys like Jeffrey Carroll, Lamont Evans, who just got done at Oklahoma State. We did find out Oklahoma State started basketball practice on Friday. We did find out that Mike Boynton, their current head coach, is still going to remain their coach. Again, like I said, Evans was a holdover from the staff previous. From all indications that we're getting, Boynton didn't know what his assistant was doing. Again, you kind of take that as what it's worth.
They always,
but as of right now, Mike Boynton's going to remain the coach at Oklahoma State. Lamont Evans was fired with cause yesterday, on Thursday. And I think next he's got a hearing in federal court in New York on October 10th is the next thing up for him. And the only other kind of embarrassing point about that was that the nature of his hiring. I mean, he was kind of held up as a great hire, There were some quotes that didn't hold up real well that came from Oklahoma State coach Mike Boynton about Lamont Evans. He trusts him with his life, and then he's a high character guy, and all this kind of stuff that, in hindsight, probably wouldn't have said. But again, and maybe that's to OSU's point that he didn't know what was going on, and that this was happening before Lamont Evans got to Oklahoma State and continued after he got there. Yeah. Basketball practice starting up too. It started Friday. So, speaking of basketball practice and things starting up, the Thunder, man, a lot of excitement about this team. It's hard to remember a season. I guess it's not that hard. That had this much excitement. You had Kevin Durant and Serge Ibaka and James Harden, Russell Westbrook, and all these guys before. But now you've got guys like Carmelo Anthony and Paul George coming in that have kind of reinvigorated the Thunder fan base. After kind of a year of woe was me after Kevin Durant left, it's been exciting to see. We got our first look at these guys in Thunder uniforms on Monday morning. They had their annual media day, and so they got to talk, and we took a whole lot of pictures of these guys in their uniforms. It's been an exciting week. It should be an incredible season. You know, they've got a compressed preseason schedule, and so they start next week with preseason games. And then after that, we jump right into regular season games about the second or third week of October. So we're right on top of it. Great story in this paper this week about the ticket prices on the secondary markets are going up. I'm sure Don's already put his on there. Because he's got season tickets. Don's going to look to cash in if he can. I'm sure he's going to hold on to a few of them. But it was interesting. As soon as they signed Carmelo Anthony, those ticket prices jumped. We had a story shortly before that about the effect of Paul George's signing on season tickets. And because the Thunder has such a great season ticket base, they didn't see much of a jump. So you have to look at secondary markets to kind of figure out what the effect of this is. And after Paul George signed, there was a little bit of a jump, but after Carmelo joined the team, I guess a couple weeks ago, there was a significant jump in prices. And I think now tickets for the home opener are about 2-3 times what they normally would be.
I'm guessing that Don could actually probably tell us down to the percentage point, but
I haven't looked.
Oh,
I haven't
yeah.
looked yet. I need to check this out. We haven't drafted our tickets yet.
okay. Yeah, a lot of excitement about the Thunder. We have that covered in so many different ways. Talk a little bit about the different things we do for Thunder coverage.
We do. We are the only media outlet in the country that goes to every single Thunder game, home or on the road. We have 2 Thunder beat writers that do a fantastic job in addition to our columnists that spot up as well. We have a special section coming out here in a couple weeks. I think it's the second Wednesday in October, previewing the season. I mean, obviously, things kind of change, and you've got to kind of readjust given the roster the way it is now. But I mean, as far as wall-to-wall coverage, you can't get much more than what we offer. We have live chats, we have blogs, we have podcasts, we have stories in the paper, stories online.
Pre-game,
and like I said,
post-game, during game.
And we're the only media outlet that goes to every single game the Thunder plays.
Yeah, and if you haven't listened to the Thunder Buddies podcast, it's
fantastic.
It's
They've
great.
been doing it for 10 years now. It's really, really good.
It really is. All right. Don, let's talk about tiny houses. This is not your house, right?
No, it's not my house. I don't live in a tiny house. My wife is intrigued by tiny houses, unfortunately.
Well, maybe she could live in one.
Yeah, well, could happen. Let's not go there. But there was a couple here in Oklahoma City that had either built or bought a tiny house, and then they bought a 2-acre plot of land in Oklahoma City, and they wanted to roll out their tiny house and live there. Well, it turns out you can't do that in Oklahoma City. And part of the main reason you can't do that is because the city never really has addressed tiny houses in the city codes or in city zoning. So they were going to have a hearing and basically have their land declared a campsite, which would have allowed them to live in their tiny house. Well, this woman who was involved in this, she has a blog, and there were at least 100 people on her blog who said they were planning to attend this meeting because they were so interested in the whole tiny house movement. So what ended up happening was there was so much interest that they canceled the meeting because now the city wants to deal with it in a more universal way and actually update their codes so that people know when they can and cannot put a tiny house on a piece of property.
Can we? Can we now? I mean,
apparently not. Apparently not. You can't just roll it out there. And I don't know all the reasons for it, but you know, if you haven't addressed it in any form in your codes, you basically, I mean, what is it? Is it a mobile home because it's on wheels? I mean, it really is. But it's also a house because you need to hook it up to certain things, but it's not sitting on a foundation. There's a lot of issues, and you just have to address it, and they never have, despite the fact that people, you know, I mean, there's a TV show, for goodness sake, and it's very popular, where people, you know, in other cities, they buy tiny houses and they plop them down on a piece of land. You see them do it on film, but you can't just do that here. But the city's going to make it. First they're going to address their codes so people know what they can and can't do, and eventually they say we're going to address zoning too. So you know, by looking at zoning rules where you can and cannot do certain things.
Interesting. Intrigued by a tiny home?
No.
Intrigued by
Not
a
at
tiny
all.
home?
There's no chance that we've got a small family. There's no chance the 3 of us could coexist in that small of a place.
Yeah, no.
No, you know, you watch the shows and the people are like, gosh, it's so small. It's called a tiny house. You knew it was 400 square feet when you opened the door. I don't get it.
Should be a clue. One last thing, Braums. Just wanted to touch on that real quickly. It's been a big issue. The High-Low Club, the area up Drunken Fry, and several other establishments up there. News on that?
Well, and Braums wants to tear all this down and build a new Braums there. And they had a hearing yesterday where nothing was decided. But the people who own the land, who are dealing with Braums, have said even if you reject this Braums store, we are going to tear down these buildings. They're history, no matter what you do. And that's the real shot in the heart for a lot of people who cherish what these buildings have been. You know, they've been clubs, and the High-Low Club has a history as one of the first places that gay people and people you know could openly get together So there's a lot of issues and a lot of people who have a lot of love for these businesses, but there's not the support from the property owners.
Progress marches on.
Right.
We have all these stories online in the newspaper. Pick it up, check it out. Thanks for joining me, guys. This was a really good discussion this week. We'll be back next week. Thanks a lot.